The correct and proper use of pesticides is vitally important to all of us that are involved in this industry. Whether you're a private applicator that's applying pesticides to your own farm, or you're a commercial applicator that applies pesticides for the public and charges a fee. Today we want to discuss briefly the history of pesticides, look at the laws and regulations that apply, look at labels and label comprehension, safety. Then we'll look at pesticide groups, formulations, and the environment. But to begin our discussion, let's take a look back and get a little bit of a perspective on pesticides and where we kind of got started. First, we need to identify what a pest is. As most of you know, a pest can be any type of organism that affects man and his crops. So that could be insects, or it could be diseases such as fungi or bacteria. It could be rodents such as mice or rats, or it could be even other forms of wildlife damage like birds, and of course weeds. All of these are pests, and it's according to what crop we're looking at. As far as pesticides go, you can go way back in history. The children of Israel used salt to desiccate the land before they took it over. In 900 AD, the Chinese first began using arsenic as an insecticide. And then in the mid-1850s, pyrethrums were discovered. They are botanical insecticides derived from chrysanthemum flowers, also lime and sulfur. But really what got us into the pesticide age came out of World War II and all of the research that was done then. Prior to World War II, in 1939, DDT was discovered by a Swiss entomologist and then was widely used during World War II. Toward the end of World War II, the organophosphates were discovered, and so that, along with a lot of other discoveries, really put us into the chemical age as far as agriculture goes in the post-World War II era. Now, let's describe what is a pesticide. A pesticide is a chemical substance that is used to kill or control pests. And as you can see here, there are a lot of different types of pesticides. Pesticides is the general term that covers all of these. An insecticide is a form of a pesticide. A herbicide is a form of a pesticide. As you see what I mean here, fungicides, rodenticides, there are several. Plant growth regulators are considered pesticides, defoliants, and desiccants. Now, let's turn our attention now to the laws and regulations that govern all of the use of pesticides. In 1947, Congress enacted the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, Rodenticide Act. We just simply call it FIFRA. FIFRA has been amended several times. In 1972 it was amended, in 84, in 1988, and then as recent as 1996 with the passage of the Food Quality Protection Act. But the purpose of FIFRA is to regulate the distribution, sale, and use of pesticides. And as you see there on the screen, the pesticide definition that we gave a little earlier, FIFRA has 34 sections, and we won't go through all of these sections, but you can see here short title and table of contents, definitions. The law lines out training, the training that you're going through to get a private applicator license here today, or a commercial applicator license is lined out in FIFRA, and so forth. But let's take a closer look at three sections. Section 3, Section 18, and Section 24C that you'll need to know for the examination. Now, Section 3 is what's called a full registration on a pesticide. That means that the pesticide or the chemical company has performed all the tests that are required and gone through all of the jumping through the hoops for EPA and they agree that it can be labeled and that it can be sold under the terms of the label. Section 18 is what's called an emergency exemption label, and these are for just that, emergency situations. They're time limited and very restrictive. An example of this may be if we have an outbreak of a certain caterpillar on cotton and we don't have a good control for that. There might be an insecticide that is being tested and has not been labeled yet, and we can petition EPA for an emergency exemption to allow the use of, let's call it brand X insecticide, and use it for maybe 2 weeks to control that particular caterpillar. But it's an emergency exemption. The other section that we want to look at, or labels, is we're talking here is Section 24C, which is called a special local needs. This permits a state to label federally registered pesticides for some uses that are not on the label. An example of this would be like a herbicide, like gramoxone, for instance, is currently labeled on, say, peanuts, but we may petition and get a special local needs to use the herbicide gramoxone on sweet potatoes in Alabama. And these labels last for several years, about 5 years. But you need to know that, a Section 3, a Section 18, and what a Section 24C is. Now let's turn our attention to the Alabama Pesticide Act of 1971. The main purpose of this state law is the same as that of FIFRA. It does, however, contain two provisions within it. The Custom Applicator Law, which regulates the custom application of pesticides by aircraft and ground equipment. And as you can see here, there are several categories: demonstration and research, ag plant, forest, right-of-way, aquatic, and so forth. And then there's the Professional Service Law, which requires licensing of those in pest control work in and around structures, lawns, sods, and ornamental plants. And you can see these categories here. Again, both of these categories, the Professional Service Law and the Custom Applicator Law, apply to commercial type pesticide application. As you can see in the Professional Service Law here, we have ornamental, turf, pest control, industrial, institutional, and household. That's for your pest control operators, and then there are others. But the Alabama State Department of Ag and Industries is the state government agency that oversees this law, and they also issue your permit when you complete the test, either as a private applicator, and private applicators are those of you that are farmers applying pesticides to your own farm, or commercial applicators. Let's turn our attention now to to a regulation that we need to be aware of. This particularly for farms is called the Worker Protection Standards. And Worker Protection Standards was added by EPA in 1992, and it applies to farms, forests, nurseries, and greenhouse operations. So the purpose of it is to protect workers. So a good example of this is if you're a farmer and you hire me to come and work for you, there are provisions that you have to have me trained and be sure that I'm trained before I apply a pesticide the first time. As we can see here, here's our provisions. You must have a central location. This is kind of like a bulletin board that you would have showing pesticide safety poster and some other information. You have to train, as I mentioned, your handlers. A handler is somebody that would actually be applying pesticides. Then if you hired somebody as just a worker, they would be someone that maybe would just do hand labor but would not be applying pesticides. So the training is a little different there. There are videotapes available in the county agent's office to assist you in training your handlers or your workers, so see them about that. Another provision is you must have a decontamination site. that's outlined in this regulation, and that's in case your workers spill pesticides on them, and they must have some water there, soap and towels, extra set of coveralls, drinking water, and so forth. Employer information exchange is required in this as well. Emergency assistance. Monitor if they are applying a hazardous material that carries a danger symbol and skull and crossbone on the pesticide. You have to contact those workers every 2 hours to be sure they're okay. And then there's some other things listed here. Personal protective equipment, that's PPE, and the REI is restricted entry interval, or we call it the re-entry interval. The time that is required to keep workers and other people out of the treated area is listed on the pesticide label. Posting of signs, if the label requires that you post a sign to the field, it'll instruct you on the label. However, greenhouses must post a sign that says that you cannot enter danger pesticides, and that must be posted before, during, and after the application and during the re-entry time. Now let's turn our attention to federal pesticide record keeping. This is for private applicators. Now, commercial applicators have to keep records by state law, but for our purposes here on this videotape, just want to mention to those of you that are private applicators, you farmers out there, you have to keep records of all restricted use pesticide applications. Now we have a nice little pocket size publication that lines all this out for you, and but this is required, and you must keep these records for 2 years. So anytime you apply a restricted use pesticide, you have to keep a record of it, and so be sure you get a hold of the copies of those. Let's look at the requirements here. You have to keep the product name, that would be the trade name, the EPA registration number, which comes off the jug, the pesticide container, and then the total amount applied, like 2 quarts per acre is what you'd want to put there, and then the area treated, maybe 40 acres crop, let's say cotton. And location, the location has to be more descriptive than just what you and I would use in everyday language, like the back 40 or something. It has to be a legal description. Again, this is outlined in our publication, and I encourage you to get one of those from your county agent. You have to put down the date of the application of the pesticide, and then your name and certification number. Let's now turn our attention to labeling. And the pesticide label is part of FIFRA, and it's the law. It's the federal law. And let's see, as you can see here, all of these different things are considered labeling. The label that's attached to the jug, and also the sales brochures or other technical information. And again, the label is a federal legal document. One of the things that is on the pesticide label that you need to know is that all pesticides have basically 3 names. As you can see here, we have a trade name, Roundup, which is sold, and also we have one here, an ortho product, Cleanup. Both of these are contain the common name glyphosate, and glyphosate is, if you look on the jug there, you can see that that's the active ingredient. And then there's also the chemical name, which is describes how the chemists put it together. So just remember, all pesticides have 3 names: a trade name, a common name, and a chemical name. Now let's look at some of the parts of the pesticide label. Again, we just discussed the trade name, and then you can see down there the common name for this example 7 is the trade name. The common name is carbaryl, and then the chemical name 1-naphthalene-carbamate. And so that's a good example. Other things that are listed on the label, of course, are the EPA registration number, which is very important when dealing with record keeping and restricted use pesticides. The establishment number tells where this particular pesticide was was jugged or where it was manufactured. And then it tells you whether it's restricted use or not, directions for use. There's also precautionary statements listed on the label, statement to the physician, information on disposal. We can't overemphasize, though it has become cliche to tell folks to read the label, but it's vitally important that you read and understand the label before you ever apply any pesticide. Let's talk now about something else that's real important on the label, and that is signal words. The signal word indicates to you the toxicity of the material. If it is danger and it has poison with a skull and crossbone, that means that it is highly toxic, and it only takes maybe a taste to a teaspoon to kill a grown man, so it's very serious business. Danger, you should always use all of the proper precautions in using this pesticide. Warning is the next signal word, which means it's moderately toxic. A teaspoon to an ounce could kill a 150-pound man, and then caution means that it's only slightly toxic and greater than an ounce as far as the toxicities go. Let's mention now that there are two types of pesticides. There are general use or unclassified pesticides that are allowed by EPA, and then there are what's called restricted use pesticides. Now let's start with restricted use pesticides. These can only be applied by certified applicators. Those of you that are commercially licensed, or those of you that have a private applicator permit. So the general public cannot apply restricted use pesticides. And the reason that they are restricted is EPA can do this for several reasons. One is for human toxicity or hazard to the environment or wildlife. It could be anything. It could be that they may show some mutagenicity, which means that they could be suspected to be cancer causing. So restricted use products are used quite frequently in agriculture, but they take special care, and that's why EPA requires a special training. Now, general use pesticides, there's several of these on the market, and these are the things that you can go and buy from a local dealer or co-op or places like that. And these generally have a caution label, and the general public are able to use them. But again, all the label and legal requirements associated with general use or restricted use are required. Let's turn our attention now to pesticide safety and application. The overall risk that you have in using any pesticide is equal to the toxicity times the exposure. The dose makes the poison. The father of modern toxicology, Paracelsus, coined this phrase back in the early 1500s. You know, all substances are poisons. There is none which is not, which is what Paracelsus said, and that is true. You take any substance at a high enough dose, and it can be toxic. Let's look here and talk about a poison, for instance. What is a poison? It's any substance which, introduced into an organism in relatively small amounts, acts chemically upon the tissues to produce serious injury or death. Ordinary table salt that most of us use every day is a good example of that. 400 milligrams per kilogram can cause a violent reaction. Aspirin, which is one of the number one problems as far as folks being accidentally poisoned every year. 15 to 45 tablets is fatal for most humans. Nicotine, for instance, which is, of course, a botanical derived chemical coming from tobacco, of course, is very toxic in the pure form. 50 milligrams per kilogram or 50 parts per million can kill a grown man. So every chemical that we use, that we ingest, are poisons at a high enough rate. The key to our safety, though, is to be sure that that we protect ourselves and don't allow any ingestion or absorption through our skin and so forth. Let's look now and talk about how routes of exposure to pesticides into our body. When you're using a pesticide, there's 4 main ways that these can be introduced into you. Orally, through your mouth, of course. Dermally, absorption through your skin. Inhalation, breathing in the fumes. And then ocular, through your eyes. There are 3 types of toxicity to pesticides. Acute is usually immediate, obvious, and reversible. And most of the time this is associated with organophosphates or carbamate insecticides because they work on the nervous system in an insect, and if you're poisoned, they will affect your nervous system. There is an antidote for those, and it's called atropine, but normally that type of toxicity will become obvious immediately upon exposure. Delayed or chronic responses to toxicity are usually from repeated doses, and this can be attributed to things like cancer and other things that are a risk from some pesticides. An allergic reaction, though, is one that you need to pay close attention to. If you or somebody that works for you is using a particular pesticide and they have an allergic reaction to it, or they have asthma, each time they are around the offending chemical, they will have this reaction, and there's really nothing you can do except probably get someone else to apply the pesticide. Let's talk about the general symptoms associated with pesticide poisoning. They are headache, giddiness, nausea, blurred vision, chest pains. These are the general symptoms that you would see if someone was poisoned with a pesticide. It's important that you have a first aid kit around any place where you're working and using pesticides. It's also good to add to this first aid kit some syrup of ipecac, which would be used in the case of an accidental swallowing. That is a vomiting type chemical that you can mix, and it will induce vomiting. The key, though, to that is you must read the label and be sure the label tells you to induce vomiting if someone accidentally swallows a pesticide. Some of them are corrosives, and you wouldn't want to you wouldn't want to induce vomiting in that case because it would do some more damage coming up. But again, the label is your guide there. Let's talk about the emergency responses to a pesticide poisoning. First aid, the first thing and best thing to do is to have already read the label so you know what the precautionary statements tell you to do and the practical steps that it tells you to do. Beyond that, probably in most cases, a trip to the emergency room with the label is the best recommendation we can make if someone's poisoned. Take the label and take them to the emergency room. Drinking milk, occasionally a farmer will be out mixing pesticides and may accidentally rub his mouth or around the nose. But if this happens, drinking milk is a good idea because milk has a lot of calcium and can help bind up some of those pesticides, some of the ions there, and help flush those out of your system. If you get a pesticide on you, it's recommended that you wash it off for 15 minutes. And this would apply for if you had it splattered in your eyes. If somebody has an inhalation exposure, get them to fresh air and stay away from those fumes. Let's turn our attention now to personal protective equipment. The equipment that's lined out on the label as to what you should wear when you're applying a pesticide. And again, this is part of the label and is required that you do this. Violation of following any aspect of the label, by the way, can be punishable by fines. And if you misuse it, don't use it according to the label, or don't provide the proper protective equipment, these things are subject to fines and legal action. So, you know, it's good business to do these things correctly, but also know that the law is behind what's on that label, as we mentioned earlier. The personal protective equipment, or PPE, is listed on the label, but you know it's too late to wear it when you end up in the emergency room like this fella here who had a hose break and the pesticide splattered on his face and caused some burning to his skin. So prevention is the key here. Minimum body protection is lined out by EPA, and you should wear a long sleeve shirt, long legged pants, chemical resistant boots, chemical resistant gloves, a wide brim hat and goggles if required on the label, and then an apron. So no short pants or flip-flops. You need to have your skin covered. Here's a good example of someone that's properly fitted with PPE. And again, remember this, the highest risk you have in working with a pesticide is when you're mixing and loading the pesticide, because why? You're working with the concentrate. And when you're working with the concentrate, the hazard is increased. Again, remember the aspect of your risk is due to the toxicity time the hazard, and then the hazard is when you're using it. So be sure to always wear your PPE when mixing, loading, and applying your pesticides. Now, if you are driving a tractor and it's a cab and all the air filters are in place, you can go without your PPE as long as all that's in place. But if you get out to adjust the sprayer or the tips, you're supposed to put the personal protective equipment back on. Let's talk briefly about cartridges or canisters. Here we're talking about respirators. Some pesticide labels will require that you wear a respirator to protect you from any vapors or gases that might be released from the pesticide. One of the main things that you need to do is have a proper fit. Have a fit test. See if you can wear it properly. You need to put the respirator on and close the inlet and cut off the air and inhale gently and see if that face mask will collapse on your face and hold your breath for 10 seconds. If you have facial hair and so forth, that'll create a little gap there, and you won't be able to get a seal, and so therefore you'll have to have somebody else apply that pesticide. Let's talk now about your clothing. After a hard day's work, you're out spraying commercially or on the farm, you're going to get dirty and you may splatter some of these pesticides on you. The proper way to treat this is that you wash your clothes separately from the rest of the family's wash, and you should rinse them twice, 2 rinse cycles to remove any excess pesticide that may be there. Now, a lot of the protection, the PPE, some folks will wear disposable clothing, and let me point out here that that's disposable clothing like these Tyvek suits should only be used once and then thrown away. One of the main keys to your success and safety is using gloves. If you will use gloves, it will reduce your exposure by 99%. Research has shown this. So by all means, obtain and wear some good rubber gloves. Neoprene gloves are very durable, and you need to have these available for yourself and for your workers, and be sure that they wear gloves. We want to turn our attention now to pesticide groups. There's a lot of different modes of action and types, as we discussed earlier, of pesticides, herbicides, insecticides, fungicides. All of these work chemically to produce some effect, hopefully to control the pest that we're looking at. And we need to have a little bit of background on that. As you can see here, there's a lot of different type groups of pesticides. Protectants. A protectant would be like a fungicide where you apply it and it would protect the plants from being infected by some fungi. So an example of a protectant would be a fungicide. Translocated herbicides are something that we use a lot. Things like glyphosate, where you apply it to the plant and it's absorbed and moves through the plant and thereby kills it. Fumigants, of course, are gases. We use these in like fumigating grain bins. Anticoagulants would be an example of maybe mice or rat baits or poisons. Anticoagulant, of course, means that it keeps blood from clotting. Contacts. We use a lot of contact insecticides, whereby as soon as it comes in touch with the insect, it affects their nervous system. Stomach poisons, things like carbaryl or 7 dust, whereby you apply it and the insect must eat it and get into his stomach before it creates, does the control for us. Selective and non-selective are generally pesticide groups refer to herbicides. A selective herbicide would be a herbicide that would select for one and leave the other. And a good example of that would be 2,4-D, which applied to a pasture would control the broadleaf weeds and leave the grass. Non-selective herbicides would be, like we talked about, something that would kill most vegetation like glyphosate or gramoxone. We don't have the time to go into all the different families, but it's important here to point out that these different groups have families within them. Like in insecticides, there's organophosphates, carbamates, there's old chlorinated hydrocarbons, and then we have a lot of new insect growth regulators or newer type insecticides, and these are different families. And for resistance management, it's good to remember to switch families. Be sure and educate yourself about which particular pesticides you use and learn the families and rotate those to help prevent resistance. One thing we need to point out to you is that all pesticides, the soil will affect how well they work. The texture of the soil, whether it's a highly sandy soil or a heavy clay, will affect how well the pesticide works. The soil pH can have a great effect on your pesticide. Organic matter, which we have very little of in our soils in Alabama, can affect your pesticides. A lot of times these are what's happening is just a chemical binding of the pesticide to the soil or to an organic matter particle. The weather affects how well your pesticide will work. Rain, of course. Humidity. High humidity will decrease the effectiveness of a lot of insecticides, for instance. The pyrethroids come to mind. High temperatures will do the same thing. So you want to avoid applying pesticides when you know that there's a big weather front coming through and a lot of thunderstorms. I know it's hard to predict this in July in Alabama, but watch the weather, as I know you do, and try to apply your pesticides when weather conditions are conducive to good control. For instance, herbicides applied when it's real cool a lot of times won't work as well. Let's talk about formulations of pesticides. Just like when you go to the store, to buy liquid Tylenol or caplets, pesticides are formulated in a lot of different ways. And let's review the formulations a little bit here. Formulations, we have liquid formulations. And one of the most common liquid formulations is an EC, emulsifiable concentrate. And emulsifiable concentrates are very versatile, and they are soluble in oil and form an emulsion in water. So when you mix them in water, they look like milk. And again, one of the things I'd like to point out to you here is the law says that you should not take the pesticide out of its original container to protect children. And also, if you've got it mixed up and in a container, it looks like milk to a small child. So be careful there, and let's don't leave any unused pesticides laying around in containers. You should use all that you mix up. But that's emulsifiable concentrates. Solutions readily dissolve in water or other solvents. However, because most chemicals will not dissolve readily, few true solution pesticides are available. But as you can see, it just looks sort of like weak tea. Let's talk about flowables or liquids. These are insoluble solids that are finely ground and mixed in a liquid, and they require moderate agitation in your tank, or they'll settle out and then you won't get the control that you need. Dry flowables or water dispersible granules are another dry formulation. These are actually formulate little tiny balls, and then they mix with the water, but they need to be constantly agitated, as well as wettable powders, which are still widely used. One thing to remember for your test is if you have a dry formulation, let's say the label says it's a 50 WP, that 50 means that it's 50% active ingredient. So if you're asked on the test, be sure to know that. If it said 80 SP, that means it's 80% active ingredient, soluble powder. How about liquid formulations? If it says 4 EC, that means there's 4 pounds of active ingredient in 1 gallon of the formulated pesticide. If it says 8 EC, that means there's 8 pounds of active ingredient in that emulsifiable concentrate. So know the difference between the active ingredient designations there. Let's talk about adjuvants just a minute. Adjuvants are things that you add to your spray mix to basically do a couple of 3 things. One is to reduce the surface tension of a water molecule. As you know, if you mix water and you spray it out, it beads up like this. So if we apply an adjuvant, it reduces the surface tension and spreads the water molecule out, and thus you get better coverage of your spray mix. Some, though, let me warn you, some pesticides already have the surfactant in there, so you don't need to go out and purchase any more. The label's your guide. There are some other adjuvants, though, things that are like anti-drift agents that you can apply that will help reduce drift, anti-foaming agents and so forth. But do your homework on surfactants. You don't always need one, but if you have a question, be sure and contact your county extension agent, but your label, again, will be your guide as far as adjuvants. Let's finish up here talking about granular insecticides and dust. One thing I want to point out to you is a granular is ready to use. You don't mix it in water, nor do you do dust. So a lot of times folks in the past have gone and bought 10% 7 dust and mixed it in water, and that doesn't work. If you want a wettable powder 7 formulation, you go and buy like a 50 WP 7 formulation as an example. Let's turn our attention now to pesticides in the environment. This is an issue that is a concern to all of us in the agricultural field, but especially to the general population as a whole. And it's very important that we understand pesticides and how they relate to the environment and what we can do to help reduce the risk out there and do a good job, be a good steward of the land and so forth that you're working with. Our environment, what is it? Well, it's everything around us, the air, soil, water, plants, houses, oceans. The goal of responsible pesticide users is to follow good practices that achieve effective pest control with little risk to the environment. One thing that we need to understand is the hydrological cycle. How, you know, there's only so much water on the earth and it's all the time recycled. So as you can see here, here's an example of how we get rainfall and the water moves down through the soil profile and down into the groundwater and comes up in our rivers and streams and creeks and so forth. And then, of course, we pump it up as well water. So we need to be concerned about what we apply to the land and how it could move down into the groundwater. Now, one of the problems that we have with pesticide applications sometimes is, especially here in Alabama, we put on a pesticide, then we get a heavy thunderstorm and we get runoff. And sometimes the pesticide can be carried away if it's a highly water-soluble material with just the rain. If it attaches to the soil very tightly and we get a heavy thunderstorm and get erosion, then some of it can be washed down into the rivers and into creeks. And then sometimes we've even had, in a few isolated cases, some fish killed. So again, the need to be aware of the weather as best we can before we apply. One of the main points to make is that once applied, not all pesticides act the same. The chemical structures and so forth are so different that none of them behave the same when they're applied out there. Let's look at this slide here. As you can see, some are broken down by sunlight very fastly. Our organophosphate insecticides come to mind. They are broken down very quickly like that. Some are taken up into the plant, as we can see here, plant uptake. Some drift away as vapors. 2,4-D, some of their formulations can vaporize and move over and drift and cause some damage to some crops that are susceptible, such as maybe tomatoes or cotton comes to mind. But as you look down here, also we have microbial breakdown of pesticides. That means we got these little microbes out here, bacteria and fungi in the soil, and they kind of chew on these pesticides and break them down. Some of them actually eat them for supper, as we could say. Some of the pesticides, though, are adsorbed to the soil. Now, that means they stick to a soil particle, and they are held there, and so that prevents them from being leached and gives them a little long persistence. And these are some of the major ways that our pesticides break down in the environment. One of the concerns that we have, especially as we have a lot of farms around urban areas, is drift. And drift is simply the movement of pesticides by air off-site to an adjacent field or site. It's important that when you apply a pesticide that you reduce drift, and the label requires that you do that. You know, just use good common sense. Let's don't apply them on windy days. Let's use more volume of water, which will create bigger water droplets, which will reduce drift. You can use a larger orifice nozzle to do that. But reducing drift is your responsibility when you apply pesticides. Another concern in applying them is non-target organisms can be harmed by pesticides in two ways: immediate or direct injury, or maybe long-term consequences of environmental pollution. As you can see here, as we talked earlier about 2,4-D, this is 2,4-D damage drifted over on a squash plant. And the curling and gnarling that's associated with 2,4-D here. Again, be sure that you do your homework and to know not to apply the 2,4-D LV ester formulation, and don't do it on a real hot day. But this shows you an example. Let's talk about some other non-target organisms that can be hurt. Our honeybees, which certainly do a lot of good for us in pollinating crops, they can be harmed, especially by insecticides. And what we need to do is try to adjust our spray times for this by not applying when honeybees are active. So maybe apply early in the morning or late in the afternoon, because honeybees come out generally from like 9 in the morning and work to 3 or 4 in the afternoon, kind of like banker's hours, I guess. But that's one thing we can do to reduce harming honeybees. We've discussed several things here today, and just want to wrap up by reminding you that the laws and regulations that are in place as far as pesticides are there to do several things. Number one, they're there to protect you as an applicator. They're there to protect the general public and to protect our environment, and that you should do everything in your power to follow the label at all times and do the right thing. It's the best thing for whatever industry you're in, whether you're a PCO, pest control operator, or you're a commercial applicator of ornamental and turf pesticides, or you're a farmer out there. The correct and proper use of pesticides is good for everyone in the industry and will help us keep pesticides labeled to help us in reducing the damage that occur from pesticides. Be sure to do the right thing as far as safety goes. You know, it's easy to not wear your gloves or your protective equipment, and then you have an accident, or one of your workers has an accident, and you will regret that you didn't use the protective equipment. So always do the right thing and wear your protective equipment. Be sure that you understand how the pesticide works, its mode of action, which group it's in, how to rotate your chemistries to keep you out of trouble with resistance. And then understand how these pesticides affect the environment, and let's do a good job in keeping our environment safe, and that will help all of us in this industry.